In the summer of 1879, in Blanco County, Texas, a 23-year-old woman paid $2 for 37 sick, coughing, gaunt goats that no one else at the Round Hollow livestock auction wanted to take home. The auctioneer laughed when she raised her hand. The farmers around her laughed too. Clara Whitfield didn't laugh. She counted out the money in dimes, handed it over with a steady hand, and walked the entire herd on foot the 6 miles to the dry land she had inherited from an uncle she had never met. No one imagined that 3 years later, the cheese made from those same goats would be the only one that survived intact through the August heat, while the rest of the county watched its dairy rot on the shelves. If you're watching from somewhere today, comment the town you're watching from, and if you want to know how 37 sick goats became the foundation of everything she built, like and stay with her until the end. The land was called Hollow Creek, a name Clara's uncle, Ezra Whitfield, had chosen decades earlier because of the dry creek bed that cut through the property most of the year, and only truly filled during the rare weeks of heavy spring rain. 120 acres of rocky land, poorly served by a well, with a wooden house that creaked in the wind, and a barn whose roof had half caved in the previous winter. Ezra had died alone, with no children, and the town lawyer, a thin man with round glasses named Thomas Pruitt, had needed nearly 2 months to locate Clara, the only living relative, then living in Austin as a seamstress in a boarding house for single women, mending the dresses of ladies who barely noticed her. Clara arrived in Round Hollow on a Tuesday in June, under a sun already strong since mid-morning, with a cracked leather trunk, $13 sewn into the hem of her skirt, and a notebook that no one but her knew the contents of. The town had a bit over 800 residents, a main street of packed dirt that turned to mud on the rare days of heavy rain, a white church, a general store run by the Dunmores, and a small bank whose owner, Silas Corwin, lent money at interest rates no one discussed out loud. People looked at Clara the way they looked at any outsider, with lukewarm curiosity that quickly turned into practical suspicion, because a woman alone inheriting land was, in the minds of almost everyone there, a woman who would soon need to sell, marry, or fail. She did none of the three right away. She spent the first week cleaning the house, fixing what could be fixed with her own hands, and walking the boundaries of the property with a notebook under her arm, noting the type of soil, the slope of the land, where the water pooled after a quick Thursday rain. No one knew, because she never told anyone, that Clara had spent 3 years, before Austin, working as an unofficial apprentice to a Swiss cheesemaker named Herr Baumgartner in a small farming colony in Missouri, where she had learned not only how to make cheese, but how to understand goats, their illnesses, their resilience, the reason a weak animal often carried richer milk than a healthy one. She kept that knowledge the way one keeps a sharp tool in a closed pocket, in no hurry to show it to anyone who didn't need to see it. The man who would become the center of her new life in Hollow Creek was Nathaniel Reyes, a 31-year-old widower who owned the neighboring property, a larger and more fertile stretch of land called Reyes Ranch, inherited from his Mexican-Texan father, who in turn had defended it with deed and gun through decades of border disputes. Nathaniel had lost his wife Louisa 2 years before in a birth that went wrong, and raised his 4-year-old daughter Mercy alone, with the distant help of an elderly neighbor who came by 3 times a week. He was a man of few words, practical to the bone, and at first saw Clara as nothing more than a complication, a city woman trying to survive on land that demanded calloused hands and a patience he doubted she had. It was he who saw her, one already heavy, hot July morning, the sky without a single visible cloud, come off the main road leading the 37 goats on foot, the hem of her skirt caked with dust, and her face red from the sun, never complaining, never stopping, counting the animals under her breath every few yards to make sure none had fallen behind. He said nothing that day. He simply watched, from atop his horse, and rode on. But he kept the scene, because it wasn't the kind of thing seen often around there, a woman alone driving a herd of sick animals with the determination of someone carrying something worth more than it seemed. The first direct contact between the two happened 4 days later, when one of the weaker goats, a gray-coated female Clara, had already named Dinah, because naming the animals was a habit she'd brought from Missouri and never abandoned, escaped through the broken fence and ended up on Nathaniel's land, near the creek that, on his side, still ran with some water. Clara crossed the boundary without hesitation, found the animal, and was carrying it back in her arms when Nathaniel appeared on horseback, cutting off her path. "That fence won't hold against a stiff wind," he said, without dismounting. "You'll lose the rest of the herd before the month's out." "I know," Clara answered, not looking away, adjusting the animal's weight in her arms. "I'll fix it as soon as I can get enough lumber." "With what?" The question wasn't cruel, just practical, the way he did everything. "I heard you paid $2 for this whole herd because no one else wanted them." "You heard right. Sick goats don't give good milk. Most of the time, they don't give anything but work." Clara adjusted Dinah in her arms and looked at him for the first time with full attention, without anger, without explaining herself more than she needed to. "How long have you been raising livestock, Mr. Reyes?" "My whole life. And I tended goats for 3 years before I came here. I know what I'm doing with them, even if no one here knows that yet." He didn't answer right away. He just nodded once, briefly, and pulled the reins to go on his way. But before he left, he turned back. "The north side of my fence line has spare lumber from the barn I rebuilt last year. It's stacked near the creek, rotting unused. Take what you need." It was the first thing resembling kindness he offered her, wrapped in practical language, without a single word more than necessary. And it was like that, between an escaped goat and a forgotten pile of lumber, that everything that came after began. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Clara built on her own, unhurried, without asking anyone's permission. She rose before sunrise, when the sky still held that gray-blue color that preceded the Texas heat in August, and went straight to the makeshift pen she'd built with stakes and wire borrowed from the Dunmores, in exchange for 2 days of sewing for the store owner's wife. She examined each goat one by one, feeling the neck, checking the eyes, checking the state of the coat, a ritual that in any neighbor's eyes would have looked like excessive fuss over animals no one wanted, but that for Clara was exactly the method Herr Baumgartner had taught her. A sick goat that survives the first week usually carries a resistance that passes into the milk, a density of fat that healthy animals rarely produce, because the body, fighting off illness, concentrates everything richest it has in order to survive. She told no one this. When her nearest neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Opal Higgins, asked over the fence why she insisted on keeping that bunch of cripples, Clara simply answered that she liked animals and left it at that. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth stayed kept in the leather-bound notebook she kept under her mattress, where she wrote, in small, tight handwriting, every detail: which goats produced more milk, at what stage of lactation, with what kind of forage, and the first attempts, still raw, still mostly wrong, at curdling milk using vegetable rennet made from prickly pear sap, a technique she'd learned from a Mexican farmer in Missouri when animal rennet was scarce. The first weeks were more failure than success. The heat of Hollow Creek was more intense than Missouri's mild climate, and the milk curdled too fast, or not enough, or the cheese came out with a grainy texture Clara threw out without hesitation, without allowing herself the luxury of sentiment over wasted work. She adjusted the recipe with each attempt: less resting time, more salt, a finer cotton cloth to drain the whey. She recorded everything. One Sunday in September, after 7 failed attempts, she produced a small disc of cheese the size of a saucer, firm, slightly tangy, with a flavor that recalled toasted nuts, and sat on the porch of the house, alone, eating that first success in silence, with no one to tell. It was by chance that Nathaniel tasted that cheese for the first time. Mercy, his daughter, had wandered off from the elderly neighbor watching her and crossed the property line chasing a kitten she saw slip through the fence almost every afternoon. Clara found her sitting in the dirt, dirty up to her elbows, laughing at the animal that fled from her every time she got close. She brought the girl inside, washed her hands in the kitchen basin, and, without thinking much about it, cut a thin slice of the cheese she kept wrapped in a damp cloth in the pantry, offering it the way one offers candy. "Is this yours?" Mercy asked, her mouth full, her eyes wide the way only a child's get in front of really good food. "It's mine, yes." "It's better than the one at the store," the girl added, licking her fingers with no ceremony whatsoever. Clara laughed, low, genuine, for the first time since arriving in Hollow Creek. That was how Nathaniel found her, when he arrived out of breath looking for his daughter, standing in the kitchen doorway watching Mercy devour a second slice, while Clara filled a cup of water for her. "Sorry," he said, his voice tight with just relieved worry, still winded from running. "She takes off after any animal she sees." "You don't need to apologize. She's good company, truly." He looked at the table, at the piece of cheese left on the plate, and raised an eyebrow, more curious than courteous. "Did this come from your goats?" he asked, still disbelieving of the taste. "It did. The sick ones." "The same ones, yes." He picked up the piece without asking, tasted it, and stayed quiet for a moment longer than was normal for a man of so few words. "This is better than any cheese I've ever bought in the whole county. I'm still fine-tuning the recipe, bit by bit. Doesn't seem like it needs much fine-tuning, honestly." It was the first time he looked at her not as a neighborly complication, but as someone who maybe knew something he didn't. He said nothing more that afternoon, just took Mercy home, but 2 weeks later showed up at the dividing fence with a practical offer. In his way, if she needed more milk to experiment with recipes, he had 2 dairy cows that produced more than his family could use, and the surplus usually just went to the pigs. Clara accepted, and that's how, between a child chasing a cat and a piece of experimental cheese, Clara Whitfield's hidden competence began, slowly, to become visible to the one person in Hollow Creek whose opinion, she now realized, mattered more than she'd like to admit. Autumn arrived, bringing with it the first hay harvest Clara managed to produce on Ezra's land. A modest but real result, enough to feed the herd through the colder months without having to buy expensive forage from the Dunmores' store. She worked the land with her own hands most days, hiring help only when the work clearly exceeded her physical strength. A boy from town named Jed Caro, 17 years old, who came twice a week in exchange for $1.50 and a hot meal, and who soon became Clara's first loyal hand, the kind of quiet ally who did the work without question and didn't repeat around town what he saw on the property. Jed was the son of a farmer who had lost part of his own land years before in a debt dispute he never fully detailed, and he carried a quiet distrust of any town authority figure, bankers, lawyers, merchants, which paradoxically made him all the more loyal to Clara, whom he saw, from the start, as someone who also didn't fully belong to Round Hollow's comfortable circle. He worked in silence most of the time, but little by little, over those autumn afternoons mending fences and gathering hay, he started asking simple questions about the goats, about why Clara insisted on examining every one of them every day, about what she saw that the other farmers in the area didn't. "Mr. Dunmore says you're wasting your time with that herd," he commented one afternoon, stacking hay in the rebuilt barn. "Says a sick goat never turns real profit, just work." "Mr. Dunmore has never tended a goat in his life, Jed. He just buys and sells what other people produce. It's easy to have opinions about work you've never done with your own hands." Jed laughed, low, a rare sound from such a reserved young man. "My mother says something like that about the bank, that it's easy to lend other people's money and charge interest without ever having planted anything in your life." "Your mother sounds like a sensible woman," Clara remarked, without pausing her own work. "Yeah, she is." He fell silent for a moment, straightening another armful of hay, his face sweaty from the whole afternoon's effort. "Ma'am, do you mind if I ask you something?" "Go ahead. Why don't you tell anyone what you know how to do? I saw you testing a cheese recipe last week, hidden behind the house, near nightfall. Why not do it in front of everybody, if you know you're good at it?" Clara paused her work for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because I still don't know if I'm good enough, Jed, and I'd rather find that out on my own, in my own mistakes, than in front of people ready to laugh at the first try that doesn't work out." It was one of the first times she voiced out loud, even if only partly, the instinct that had guided her since childhood, the need to fully master something before exposing it to others' judgment. A habit born from the same pain she'd felt, years before, when her aunt had laughed at the knowledge she'd brought from Missouri, calling it poor folks' stuff. It was also in autumn that Clara refined her curdling process enough to produce consistent cheeses, able to mature for weeks without spoiling, an advance she didn't yet know would become the foundation of everything she would go on to build. She wrapped each disc in boiled cotton cloth, stored them on a stone shelf inside the rustic cellar Ezra had dug decades earlier beneath the house, a space that stayed cool even on the hottest days, and turned each piece daily, with the patience of someone who knew that a good result came from repetition, not haste. Mercy started crossing the fence almost every day after that first visit, and Clara, without planning it, became a fixed presence in the girl's routine, not a substitute for the mother she was missing, but something simpler and more solid, someone who taught her to recognize herbs in the field, to tell apart the bleat of a pregnant goat from that of a merely startled one, to stir warm milk slowly without letting lumps form. Nathaniel watched these moments from a distance, often pretending to be busy with some other task, but paying close enough attention to notice that his daughter laughed more, slept better, and once even called Clara, without meaning to, almost aunt, in an offhand remark at dinner, which made Nathaniel choke on his own coffee and change the subject quickly. The relationship between the two adults grew with the same cautious, practical rhythm that defined everything in Hollow Creek. No declarations, no grand gestures, just a succession of small proofs of trust repeated over weeks. He fixed the roof of her barn one Saturday in October, without warning, showing up early in the morning with hammer and nails and saying only that roof was going to give out in the first hard December wind, as if he were merely avoiding a future problem of his own and not doing her a favor. She, in turn, started leaving a piece of aged cheese at the dividing fence every Friday, wrapped in clean cloth, no note, no explanation, and he started expecting it, though he never said so out loud. It was on a cold November night, after Mercy was already asleep, and Nathaniel had come to fetch her from Clara's house after another afternoon of play, that the two had their first truly long conversation since they'd met. He accepted the invitation for a cup of coffee, declined on the two previous occasions for reasons neither of them named, and sat at the kitchen table, looking around the house Clara had, little by little, transformed. Curtains she'd sewn herself, a vase of dried wildflowers, shelves neatly lined with preserved jars. "Louisa used to like keeping the house like this, too," he said suddenly, looking at the curtains. "Full of little things nobody asks for, but that make a difference." Clara said nothing right away, just poured the coffee, giving him room to go on or not. "I'm not saying this to compare you two," he added, a little uncomfortable with his own words, his eyes fixed on the coffee cup already going cold in his hands. "I'm just saying that it's been a long time since this house next door had anyone taking care of it like this, and it's good to see it again." "Thank you," Clara answered, simply, without trying to turn the moment into something bigger than it was. "My mother used to do the same. She said a well-kept house is the one fortune no one can take from you." "Is your mother still alive?" "No. She died when I was 16. After that, I went to live with an aunt in Austin, until I came here." He nodded, without pressing for more details, recognizing in her the same instinct to not reveal more than necessary that he himself had carried since Luisa's death. It was there, over 2 cups of coffee that went cold without either of them minding, that something neither of them was in a hurry to name, not yet, was born. December brought Clara's first winter in Hollow Creek, harsher than she expected, with frosts that covered the fields in a thin white in the mornings and forced the herd to stay penned in the covered enclosure she and Jed had reinforced weeks before. It was also the month Clara produced, for the first time, a batch of 12 cheeses aged enough to sell, not just to experiment with, but to actually sell, and decided, against the quiet counsel of her own caution, to bring a sample to the Dunmore's general store, where Harlan Dunmore, the owner, measured every cent of credit he extended to the region's farmers with a wariness bordering on stinginess. Harlan Dunmore was a man in his 50s, heavy-set, with a thick mustache and small eyes that calculated the worth of everything before deciding whether it was worth his attention. He'd run the only general store in Round Hollow for 20 years, and had the fixed habit, repeated with every new farmer, every woman alone, every outsider who showed up with something to sell, of undervaluing the product on the first offer, hoping the seller's need would drive the price down before any real negotiation even began. "Goat cheese," he said, turning one of the discs over in his thick hand, without tasting it. "Nobody around here buys goat cheese, Miss Whitfield. People want cow cheese. That's what they know." "Please try it before you decide," Clara answered, in a calm tone that gave away nothing of how much that moment mattered to her. He tasted it, reluctantly, cutting a thin sliver with the counter knife. He chewed slowly, and for 1 second, just one, something in his face changed, a surprise quickly hidden behind the same calculating expression as always. "It's not bad," he admitted grudgingly, "but I've got no way of knowing if it'll sell. I can take the 12 on consignment, 20 cents each, if they sell. If they don't sell in 2 weeks, you take them back." It was a low offer, almost insulting, but Clara knew, because she'd calculated it before leaving home, that she needed to start somewhere, and a shelf in the town's only store was worth more in the long run than a prideful refusal. She accepted. The 12 cheeses sold in 4 days, and before the week was out, Harlan was already asking for more, though still with the same tone of a man doing a favor rather than making a fair deal. Clara's second antagonist arrived less directly, through gossip that spread through town like dust carried on the dry January wind. Opal Higgins, the neighbor who had already shown disapproval of the crippled goats months before, had the fixed habit of turning any observation into suspicion, and any suspicion into rumor shared over the backyard fence, on the clothesline, in the church line on Sundays. She was the first to remark, loud enough to be heard by 3 other ladies at the church door, that it was strange for Nathaniel Reyes's daughter to spend so much time at that single woman's house next door, and that it wasn't natural for a widower to bring coffee to his neighbor every week without there being some intention behind it. "I'm not saying anything bad," Opal always finished, with the same thin smile that preceded every rumor she spread. "I'm just observing what everyone's already seeing." The rumor reached Clara's ears through Jed, who had overheard 2 women talking at the store, and, without malice, repeated it all while helping fix a fence one February afternoon. Clara listened in silence, giving no visible reaction, but felt the weight of judgment settle over something that, until then, she had allowed to grow slowly and peacefully. When she mentioned the matter to Nathaniel, indirectly, asking if he'd already heard people talking about things, he just scoffed, irritated. Opal Higgins would comment on the color of the sky if she thought someone would listen. Don't let it change anything. But that was easier said than done, in a small town where reputation was worth almost as much as land. The third antagonist, and the most dangerous of the 3, had a name and a face Clara already knew before she even arrived in Hollow Creek. Elias Vance, a 28-year-old man who had been, years before, her formal suitor in Austin, a relationship arranged by the aunt she lived with, based on convenience and social standing, never on real affection. Clara had refused the marriage shortly before her aunt died, claiming she preferred her independence to a life planned by someone else, a decision that had humiliated Elias publicly in front of his own business partners in Austin, and that he had never forgiven nor forgotten. Elias reappeared in Round Hollow one March afternoon, dressed in clothes too fine for the dust of the main street, staying at the town's only decent boarding house and spreading, with careful politeness, that he was passing through on business. A thin lie no one in Hollow Creek had any way of disproving, but that Clara recognized immediately for what it was. He had somehow learned of the growing value of Ezra's property and had come to claim what he considered, in his twisted logic of a man used to getting what he wanted, still his by right of a broken promise. "You're prettier than you were in Austin," he said, meeting her by chance at the store door, tipping his hat with an exaggeratedly courteous gesture. "Country air seems to have done you good." "Elias." Clara kept her voice neutral, her body slightly distant. "I wasn't expecting to see you so far from home. Let's say I heard some interesting things about your uncle's inheritance. Quite a property for a woman to manage alone. Must be exhausting." "I'm getting along fine." "I'm sure you are." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "But remember, Clara, a broken promise has a way of coming back, sooner or later, to be collected." He left before she could respond, leaving the threat hanging in the hot March air like dust that wouldn't settle. Clara told no one about that encounter, not even Nathaniel, not yet, but spent the following night unable to sleep, going back over the notebook under her mattress, checking for the first time since her arrival whether the property deed was truly secure, kept where it should be, out of reach of any hand but her own. The fourth antagonist revealed himself gradually, almost disguised behind a facade of respectability. Silas Corwin, owner of Round Hollow's small bank, a thin man with graying sideburns, always impeccably dressed, even in the most intense summer heat, who greeted everyone with a firm handshake and a rehearsed businessman's smile, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. Corwin had the fixed habit of lending money to struggling farmers at interest rates that looked reasonable on paper, but that, combined with automatic renewal clauses buried in fine print, frequently resulted in mortgage foreclosures within 2 or 3 years, a pattern he had repeated with at least 4 families since opening the bank, always absorbing the lost land at prices far below its real value. Clara learned of this reputation through Jed, whose own father had lost part of his land to Corwin years before, and the information stayed tucked away, quiet, as one more piece on a board she still couldn't see completely, but that, she suspected correctly, was still to reveal itself in full. The spring of 1880 brought with it not only the rains that finally filled Hollow Creek's dry creek bed, but also the beginning of Elias Vance's real campaign against Clara's independence, a quiet campaign, elegant in appearance, but calculated in every move. He didn't approach her directly again after that first encounter at the store. Instead, he began frequenting Silas Corwin's bank with a regularity that didn't go unnoticed, and within a few weeks the two men had become frequent cigar companions on the bank's porch, trading information neither had any genuine reason to share, except the common interest both, for different reasons, had in seeing Clara Whitfield fail or be forced to sell. Corwin discovered, through public records he examined unhurriedly, that Ezra Whitfield's deed contained an uncommon clause, an old loan, taken out by Ezra himself 15 years earlier to finance the drilling of the property's well, that had never been fully paid off, and that, due to a filing error by the previous bank, absorbed by Corwin himself 2 years before, had gone unnoticed during the transfer of the inheritance to Clara. Technically, the debt still existed, now under her responsibility, and it carried an early maturity clause in case it wasn't identified and settled within a deadline set by state law, a deadline that, Corwin calculated with cold satisfaction, would expire that August. He kept that information the way one keeps a card up a sleeve, waiting for the most advantageous moment to reveal it, not because he necessarily wanted to destroy Clara, but because Hollow Creek's land, with its budding reputation for fine cheeses and its newly recovered well, was worth considerably more than it had been worth a year before, when he'd barely noticed its existence in the bank's books. Elias, for his part, moved on another front, more social than financial. He started attending church on Sundays, something he'd never done in Austin, always sitting in the back rows, close enough to greet Clara with an impeccable politeness that, to strangers' eyes, looked like the genuine concern of an old acquaintance. He remarked, in seemingly innocent conversations with Opal Higgins and other ladies in town, that he'd known Clara in happier times in Austin, that she'd always been a girl of too independent a spirit for her own good, planting, with each carefully measured phrase, small seeds of doubt about her character without ever saying anything that could be directly challenged as a lie. "He seems like such a gentleman," Opal remarked to Clara one Sunday after Mass, with that same thin smile as always. "It's a shame things didn't work out between you two in Austin. He speaks so well of you, in spite of everything." "In spite of what, exactly?" Clara asked, keeping her voice calm despite the mounting discomfort. "Oh, he didn't go into details, just said it was a hasty decision on your part, but he holds no grudge, which is very noble." Clara didn't respond directly, just said her goodbyes politely and walked home with a knot in her stomach, understanding, for the first time with total clarity, that Elias hadn't come to Round Hollow to win her back. He'd come to destroy her little by little, turning her, through insinuations no one could prove or disprove, into a woman of questionable reputation whose independence would increasingly be seen as a character flaw rather than a strength. The situation worsened in May, when a telegram arrived at the office of Thomas Pruitt, the lawyer who had originally located Clara in Austin, a telegram from a distant cousin of Ezra Whitfield's, a man named Cyrus Whitfield who lived in Georgia and who, upon learning for the first time, through a business contact, that Ezra's property held growing value, decided to contest the validity of the will, claiming that, as the nearest male relative, he held preferential right to the inheritance, regardless of the deceased's explicit written wishes. Pruitt brought the news to Clara in person, riding the 6 miles to Hollow Creek on a rainy May afternoon, his face tense with the weight of bad news. "Your uncle's will is clear, Clara. Legally, you're protected. But contests like this can drag on for months, even years, in state courts, and in the meantime the property's title stays disputed, which means you can't sell, can't use it as collateral for a loan, and, more worrying still, can't settle any outstanding debt tied to the land." Clara's blood ran cold hearing that, because she still didn't know about the well debt Corwin was keeping secret, but she sensed, with sharp instinct, that the pieces were starting to move around her in a way she still couldn't fully see. "What do I do, Thomas?" "Gather proof that the will reflects your uncle's real wishes. Witnesses who can confirm he always meant to leave the land to you, and honestly, Clara, hope that Cyrus Whitfield loses interest before the case actually reaches a court. Contests like this are, most of the time, more about greed than justice. If he figures the cost of the process outweighs what he stands to gain, he'll drop it." It was Nathaniel who, on hearing the news from Clara one tense night in her kitchen, offered the first concrete help. He knew Ezra's old foreman, a man named Amos Fenwick who had moved to the neighboring county, but who had worked for Ezra for nearly a decade and could certainly testify to the old farmer's intentions regarding the niece he'd never gotten to meet in person, but of whom he spoke with anticipated pride in the rare letters he exchanged with Austin. "I'll go there myself," Nathaniel said, not asking whether she wanted or needed it, simply deciding. "Fenwick owes me a favor from years back. He'll testify if I ask him to." "You don't need to do this, Nathaniel," she said, still trying to process the magnitude of the gesture. "I know I don't need to." He looked at her with a seriousness that left no room for doubt. "I'm doing it because I want to." It was the closest thing to a declaration he had said up to that point, and Clara felt its weight far beyond the simple words that made it up. Meanwhile, Corwin's pressure at the bank began to show more directly. He started refusing, with polite but firm excuses, any attempt by Clara to open a small line of credit to expand her cheese production, something she needed to do before summer, when demand at the Dunmore's store already exceeded her current production capacity. Without credit, without being able to buy more equipment or hire extra help, Clara watched her expansion stall right at the moment it was finally starting to pay off. And she didn't yet know that Corwin's refusal wasn't an accident or simple banking caution, but a deliberate part of a larger plan. It was Jed who, without meaning to, revealed the first real clue to what lay behind it all. One June afternoon, while helping fix the roof of the cellar, he mentioned casually that he'd seen Elias Vance leaving Corwin's bank again, and that the two seemed to always talk with their heads close together, lowering their voices whenever anyone came near. Clara kept that information with the same care she kept her cheese recipes, revealing nothing, but processing every detail, beginning to stitch together, piece by piece, the full picture of a threat that was no longer theoretical. It was on a hot July night, almost exactly a year after buying the 37 sick goats, that Clara finally told Nathaniel the whole story of Herr Baumgartner and Missouri. Not because the situation called for it, but because, for the first time since her mother's death, she felt there was someone in front of whom she could be whole, without needing to keep parts of herself locked away in closed drawers. They were sitting on the porch of Clara's house, Mercy already asleep inside, the sky thick with the kind of stars that only appeared on moonless nights, when Nathaniel asked, almost in passing, how she'd learned to make cheese like that, a question he'd asked before, more lightly, and that she'd always deflected with short answers. This time, she didn't deflect. After my mother died, my aunt sent me to live with a distant cousin at a farming colony in Missouri, because she couldn't afford to support me in Austin. I stayed there 3 years. That's where I met Herr Baumgartner, an old Swiss man, a widower, no children, who raised goats and made cheese the way he'd learned back home before he immigrated. He had no one to teach what he knew, and I had nothing but time and the will to learn something that was mine. He taught me everything: how to recognize a sick goat still worth treating, how to make rennet when there's no money to buy it, how to age cheese in a climate that forgives no mistakes. Why did you never tell me this before? Clara looked down at her own hands, calloused in a way they hadn't been a year before. Because in Austin, when I told my aunt I knew how to make cheese, she laughed and said it was poor folks' knowledge, worth nothing to a girl who needed to land a good marriage. I learned to keep the things I actually know how to do to myself, Nathaniel, because people decide their worth before they even see the result. I'm not like that. I know you're not. She finally looked him in the eye. That's why I'm telling you now. He stayed quiet for a moment, taking in not just the story, but the weight of the trust she had just placed in him, and then, with the same direct honesty that defined everything he did, said the closest thing to a promise he had ever told her up to that point. You're going to build something here that no one in this county will be able to ignore, Clara. I see it clearly, even now, this early on, and when it happens, I want to be here to see it. It was that same night that Clara, moved by the newly earned intimacy, also told him about the encounter with Elias at the store months before and the veiled threat he'd made. Nathaniel listened in tense silence, his jaw set, and when she finished, he rose from his chair with a cold determination she had never seen in him before. Why didn't you tell me right away? Because I didn't want you to think I needed protecting. I wanted to handle it myself. Clara, he stopped in front of her, his voice softer now, but still firm. It's one thing to solve your own problems because you're capable of it, and you are, more capable than anyone I've ever known. It's another thing to face a man like that alone, just to prove you don't need anyone. Let the people who care about you help when it's needed. That doesn't take anything away from what you've built. It was one of the most important moments between the two of them. Not because it solved Elias's threat or Corwin's hidden debt, which neither of them fully knew about yet, but because it established, clearly and mutually, that what was growing between them was no longer just convenient neighborliness or practical gratitude. It was something the two of them, each at their own cautious pace, were finally beginning to name in silence, even without saying the word out loud. That same week, Clara decided, for the first time, to show Nathaniel the leather notebook she kept under her mattress, the complete notes from 3 years of learning with Baumgartner, the tested and adjusted recipes, the records of every goat and every batch of cheese produced at Hollow Creek. He leafed through the pages with an almost reverent care, recognizing they're not just recipes, but the map of a disciplined, patient mind he'd already suspected lay behind Clara's constant calm, but had never seen documented with such clarity. "This here is worth more than all the land at Hollow Creek," he said, closing the notebook carefully. "You know that, don't you?" "I'm starting to." August of 1880 arrived with the harshest heat Round Hollow had recorded in years, the kind of heat that cracked the earth and made even the most reliable wells drop their levels worryingly. And it was exactly that month, just as Silas Corwin had calculated with cold precision months before, that the legal deadline for settling Ezra Whitfield's forgotten well debt finally expired. Corwin chose the moment to reveal the debt with almost theatrical care. He summoned Clara to the bank through a formal note delivered by one of the tellers, setting the meeting for a Friday morning, when he knew the store and Main Street would be busy enough that the news, whatever it was, would spread quickly through town. Clara arrived punctually, dressed with the same calm dignity she had carried for over a year now, not yet knowing what awaited her. "Miss Whitfield," Corwin began, hands folded on his office desk, the carefully neutral tone he reserved for the moments that gave him the most pleasure. During a routine review of records inherited from the previous bank, we discovered an unresolved matter tied to the Hollow Creek property, a loan taken out by your uncle 15 years ago to finance the drilling of the well, in the original amount of $240, which was never fully paid off. "That's impossible. My uncle managed his own finances carefully. He would have paid that debt. And perhaps he would have, had he known it still existed." Corwin opened a folder of carefully organized papers. "It seems there was a filing error during the transition between the previous bank and mine 2 years ago. The remaining balance, with interest accrued over 15 years, now totals $385. And unfortunately, the original clause called for early maturity of the full debt if it wasn't identified and settled within 1 year of the property's title transfer, a deadline that, according to our records, expired yesterday." The floor seemed to give way beneath Clara's feet. $385 was more money than she had ever seen together in her entire life, far more than any profit her cheese production, still modestly growing, could generate in time. "How much time do I have?" 30 days for full payment." Corwin closed the folder with a smooth, almost gentle gesture, which made it all the more cruel. "Otherwise, the bank will be obligated to foreclose on the debt through the property that secures it, which is, unfortunately, all of the Hollow Creek land." Clara left the bank with weak legs, but her face composed enough not to give Corwin, or anyone who saw her on the street, the satisfaction of watching her fall apart in public. It was only once she got home, alone, that she let her hands shake while trying, unsuccessfully, to figure out how much she actually had saved. $112, saved penny by penny over an entire year of nearly non-stop work, less than a third of what she needed. It was Thomas Pruitt who, hearing the news hours later, pointed out what Clara, gripped by the initial shock, hadn't noticed. The coincidence between the exact moment the debt was revealed and Elias Vance's continued presence in town was too great to be accidental. "This isn't a coincidence, Clara. Corwin knew about this debt for months, I'm sure of it. He just waited for the right moment to act, probably hoping your cousin Cyrus's contest of the will would weaken your position even further, making it nearly impossible for you to fight anything in court at the same time. The suspicion was confirmed cruelly 2 days later, when Elias approached Clara directly, this time without any pretense of disguised courtesy. "I heard you're facing some financial trouble," he said, meeting her on the road near the store, his tone now stripped of any pretense of kindness. "I must say I'm deeply sorry to see you in this position, Clara, but I must also say I have a simple solution to this whole problem." "I'm not interested, Elias. You haven't even heard the proposal yet." He smiled, the same cold smile from months before. "I'm willing to pay off your entire debt to Corwin today in exchange for you finally accepting what you should have accepted in Austin, a formal marriage. You keep the property, I get a capable wife who, I must admit, is far more interesting than I imagined when I first met her. Everyone comes out satisfied." Clara felt anger rise in her throat, cold and controlled, exactly the way she had learned to control every difficult emotion throughout her life. "I'd rather lose the whole land than accept that, Elias, and I'd rather die poor than owe you anything for the rest of my life." That's pride talking, Clara, not good sense. "It's a choice, Elias, and it's mine to make." He left irritated, but not defeated, making clear, with one last calculating look, that he wouldn't give up easily. And Clara, alone again, felt for the first time in over a year the full weight of what was at stake. Not just the land, but everything she had built upon it. The solution, when it finally came, didn't arise from a stroke of luck or a grand gesture from any man trying to save her. It came, like almost everything in Clara's life, from the patient work she had already been building for over a year, without yet knowing that this exact work would be what saved her. Amos Fenwick, Ezra's old foreman located by Nathaniel months before, not only agreed to testify about the old farmer's intentions regarding the will, he also revealed, during the conversation with Nathaniel, a piece of information that would change everything. Ezra Whitfield, in his last years, had corresponded regularly with a fine dairy buyer in San Antonio, a man named Reginald Foster, who ran a small but growing chain of specialty grocery stores in the big city, and who had for years been looking for a reliable supplier of quality goat cheese, a rare and prized product in Texas at that time, but nearly impossible to find outside of European immigrant communities. Nathaniel brought this information to Clara with an urgency he rarely showed, and the two of them, together, wrote a detailed letter to Foster, including aged cheese samples, carefully packed and sent by the stagecoach mail that passed through Round Hollow twice a week. The reply arrived 13 days later. An agonizing wait, considering only 17 days remained until the debt's due date. But when it arrived, it brought exactly the turnaround Clara needed. Foster was willing to buy, immediately, 50 aged cheeses at a price of $1.20 each, far above what she got at the local store, with the promise of an ongoing contract if the quality held, a contract that, combined with the immediate sale, would yield exactly $60 up front, and the basis to negotiate a larger advance with a San Antonio bank with no ties whatsoever to Silas Corwin. It was Nathaniel who, with the same quiet determination that defined his every action, traveled personally to San Antonio to close the deal with Foster and, using the signed contract as collateral, negotiated a short-term loan with a bank in the big city. A larger, more impersonal institution, but also one far more willing to trust the concrete numbers of a business contract than Corwin had ever been willing to trust Clara. The loan, combined with her savings and Foster's initial payment, covered the entire debt with a day to spare before the final deadline. With the debt paid off and the contract with Reginald Foster signed, the autumn of 1880 marked the beginning of a transformation in Hollow Creek that went far beyond simply surviving one more threat. Clara, now with real working capital for the first time since arriving at the property, made a decision that surprised even Nathaniel. Instead of expanding purely for personal profit, she decided to build something that would serve the whole community, not just herself. The idea was born from a simple conversation with Jed, who mentioned, almost in passing, that his father, one of the farmers who had lost land to Corwin years before, still had a small herd of goats the family didn't know how to make use of beyond raw milk sold at a low price. Clara realized, in that moment, that she wasn't the only one in the area with underused animals and knowledge, just the only one who, until then, had the method to turn it into something of real value. She proposed to Jed and then to 3 other families in the area facing similar hardships, families who, like his, had lost part of their land or savings to Corwin's heavy interest over the years, and who now got by with small, poorly used herds and milk sold for a pittance at the store, a simple partnership. She would teach the cheese-making method she had perfected over more than a year, provide access to the aging cellar Ezra had dug decades before, now expanded with extra shelves Nathaniel and Jed had built over the winter, and, in exchange, buy the family's surplus milk at a fair price, far above what Harlan Dunmore or any buyer in town had ever offered. This is going to cost time and teaching you could be using just for your own profit, Nathaniel remarked one night, watching her organize the first meetings with interested families. I know, Clara answered, without hesitating. But no one helped me get here on my own, Nathaniel. You gave me lumber when I had no fence. Fenwick testified for me without asking anything in return. Foster took a risk on an unknown farmer because he trusted the quality of what I sent. If I build this just for myself, I'm forgetting everything that got me here. That's how, over the winter of 1880 and the spring of 1881, what would become known around the region simply as the Hollow Creek Cooperative was born, an informal arrangement, without any complicated legal contract, built entirely on the word and trust Clara had carefully built over 2 years. 5 families, including Jed's, began supplying goat milk regularly, learning little by little, under Clara's patient guidance, basic animal care techniques that reduced illness and increased milk production sustainably, without pushing the animals beyond what was healthy. The cellar beneath Clara's house, now expanded to accommodate the growing volume of production, became the physical center of this small communal empire. Stone shelves stacked with cheeses at different stages of aging, the cool, faintly tangy air of the underground space carrying the distinct smell any visitor could recognize from a distance, each batch marked with hand-sewn cloth tags noting the date and the supplying family. A simple but effective tracking system Clara had developed to ensure consistent quality in every shipment sent to Foster in San Antonio. The contract with Foster grew steadily throughout 1881, from 50 cheeses a month to nearly 200, as his chain of grocery stores expanded and the reputation of the Whitfield cheese of Hollow Creek began to spread among well-off families in San Antonio who appreciated a rare and well-made product. With demand rising, Clara reinvested much of the profit back into the property and the community. She bought a second, deeper well that guaranteed water even in the driest summers, fully renovated the barn that still bore the marks of neglect from Ezra's later years, and, what surprised the whole town most, funded the construction of a small one-room schoolhouse on the road between Hollow Creek and Round Hollow, a project she had been imagining since the earliest months, when she had realized that Mercy and other children in the area had to walk nearly an hour to the nearest school in town, and that many families simply didn't send their children because of the distance. The school, informally nicknamed by neighbors Clara's School, despite her modest protests, opened its doors on a cold September morning in 1881, its walls still smelling of fresh wood and new paint, with a teacher hired from San Antonio, a young woman named Ruth Ashby, recommended by Reginald Foster himself, and 12 students in the first class, including Mercy, Jed Caro's 2 younger siblings, and 3 children from another cooperative family who, without that school, would likely have grown up never learning to read. You didn't need to do this, Nathaniel said, on the afternoon of the opening, watching Mercy run across the small, packed dirt yard with other children, Her face lit up in a way he rarely saw since Luisa's death. "I know I didn't need to," Clara answered, unknowingly echoing his own words from months before, on the night he'd offered to travel to Fenwick's. "I'm doing it because I want to." He laughed, low, recognizing the echo, and for a moment the two of them stood in silence, watching the tangible result of everything they had built together over just a little more than 2 years. Not just a successful business partnership, but an entire community transformed by decisions Clara had made with the same calm patience that had defined her since the first day she paid $2 for 37 goats no one else wanted. The contest of the will filed by Cyrus Whitfield, delayed and dragged out over months, exactly as Thomas Pruitt had predicted, finally reached a formal hearing at the county courthouse in October 1881, more than a year after it began. Cyrus, who had never actually traveled to Texas in person, had sent a hired lawyer to represent him, a dry man from Austin who argued based on legal technicalities about lineage and preferential male right, but who had, in practice, no witness who had personally known Ezra Whitfield or could speak to his real intentions. The hearing was held at the small Round Hollow courthouse, the same red brick building where town meetings and, occasionally, church gatherings also took place. And, that October morning, the room was fuller than anyone remembered ever seeing it, not out of morbid curiosity, but because the entire community that had grown up around Clara's cooperative showed up to testify on her behalf. Jed Caro and his parents, the other milk-supplying families, Ruth Ashby, the school's teacher, Harlan Dunmore, who despite his initial stinginess had benefited considerably from the traffic Clara's production had brought to his store, and even Opal Higgins, whose sharp tongue had, over the past year, turned more toward praise than defamation as she witnessed firsthand what Clara had built. Amos Fenwick traveled from the neighboring county specifically to testify, confirming under oath that Ezra Whitfield had spoken often, in his final years, of his wish to leave the property to the niece he had never met in person, but of whom he'd carried anticipated pride through the letters exchanged with family in Austin, letters that Thomas Pruitt himself submitted as documentary evidence, preserved in the files he'd inherited along with Ezra's legal affairs. The justice of the peace, an elderly man named Walter Higgins, a distant relative of Opal's, but known for his reputation of strict impartiality, heard the arguments from both sides with formal patience, but didn't need much time to decide. The will was clear, the witnesses were consistent, and Cyrus's lawyer, sensing the obvious weakness of his own case in the face of so much concrete evidence, practically gave up before the formal ruling was even read aloud. "The contest is dismissed," Judge Higgins declared, striking the small wooden gavel on the table with a dry sound that echoed through the packed room. "The Hollow Creek property remains, fully and legally, under the ownership of Clara Whitfield, in accordance with the express and duly documented will of Ezra Whitfield." A murmur of relief and genuine satisfaction passed through the room, not the kind of dramatic applause of an urban courtroom, but something more contained and more real. Neighbors nodding at each other, Jed grinning wide, Nathaniel, seated beside Clara in the front row, holding her hand for a brief moment under the table, out of everyone's sight, a small gesture that carried more meaning than any public speech could. It was on the way out of the courthouse, amid the crowd of people greeting Clara and wishing her well, that Elias Vance appeared for the last time in Round Hollow. Not to claim anything, but to witness, with a mix of irritation and bitter resignation, the complete defeat of everything he had tried to build against her. Silas Corwin stood beside him, his face closed off, aware that his attempt to use the forgotten well debt as a weapon against Clara had not only failed, but had, in the process, publicly exposed his practice of lending money under questionable terms, a reputation that was already starting to drive away clients who had once trusted him without question. "This doesn't change anything between us," Elias said, approaching Clara with the last scraps of arrogance he could still muster. "You're still going to need allies in this county, Clara, and I can still be one of them. if you decide to be reasonable." It was Nathaniel who answered, stepping calmly to Clara's side, his voice low but absolutely firm. "She already has enough allies, Vance, and none of them is you. I'd suggest heading back to Austin before this whole town decides it's heard quite enough about your visits." Elias looked around, realizing for the first time with total clarity how thoroughly the community had closed ranks around Clara, how every face in the crowd, even those who months before had listened with interest to the rumors he and Opal had planted, now looked at him with a distrust he had no way of undoing with charm or money. With nothing more to say, he adjusted his hat and left Round Hollow for good that same afternoon, boarding the evening stagecoach without saying goodbye to anyone, never to appear in Clara Whitfield's life again. Corwin, for his part, faced slower but equally decisive consequences. In the following months, as the story of his attempt to foreclose on the forgotten debt spread, not as malicious gossip, but as a relevant fact about the conduct of a man who managed the whole community's money, several farmers who had once depended on his bank began seeking credit in Blanco, the larger town 2 hours away, even though it meant a longer trip. Within 2 years, Corwin's bank had shrunk to the point where he had to sell part of his holdings to a larger San Antonio bank just to keep the doors open. A quiet but complete humiliation that no court ever needed to impose. Life in Hollow Creek, in the months that followed the court's decision, settled into a rhythm Clara had barely dared to imagine when she arrived, 2 years earlier, with a cracked trunk and $13 sewn into the hem of her skirt. The winter of 1881 arrived milder than the one before, and for the first time since Ezra's death, the property's house received repairs that went beyond simple necessity. A new covered porch, built by Nathaniel and Jed over 3 weekends, wide enough to hold the increasingly frequent gatherings of the cooperative families, which had gradually become less business and more genuine community, trading not just milk and cheese, but preserved recipes, home remedies for sick livestock, and, on the coldest nights, stories told around the iron stove Clara had had installed in the larger kitchen. It was during one of these gatherings, on a December night with frost covering the fields, that Nathaniel finally said out loud what the two of them had been quietly building for over a year. It wasn't a grand gesture. There was no bent knee or rehearsed speech, because neither of them was made for that kind of theater. It was after the last guests had left, Mercy already asleep in the room she'd come to consider almost as much her own as her real one, and the two of them sitting on the new porch, the same comfortable silence between them as always. "It's been 18 months since that night you told me about Baumgartner," he said, looking at the stars instead of at her, his way of saying hard things. "And I still don't quite know how to say this without it sounding like I'm making a business arrangement, because that's how I think best. But that's not what this is, Clara. It's not convenience, it's not the practicality of two neighbors who get along well. I want you in my life in a way that has nothing to do with a shared fence or cheese traded for milk." Clara stayed silent for a moment, feeling the genuine weight of those words coming from a man who measured every one of them with the care of someone who knew exactly what he was saying. "I don't know how to say these things in the pretty way you probably deserve to hear either," she finally answered. "But since that first afternoon you asked me how I was going to fix the fence without lumber, part of me already knew I didn't want to build this life without you near." There was no formal proposal that night. The two agreed, without needing many words, that a rushed marriage didn't suit either of them, and that Mercy, who already loved Clara with the ease only children have, deserved to see this decision mature slowly, the same way everything else at Hollow Creek had matured, unhurried, but with absolute certainty. The formal proposal came only the following spring, in April 1882, at a moment carrying the symbolic weight of everything the two had gone through together. Nathaniel led her to the original dividing fence between the two properties, the very same broken fence where Dinah, the gray goat, had escaped almost 3 years before, and there, with the lumber now reinforced and solid, He handed Clara a piece of aged cheese wrapped in the same kind of cloth she had used for years for her weekly deliveries, but with a simple gold ring hidden inside the wrapping. "Seemed fitting," he said, "the closest thing to humor he could manage in important moments. Considering that's how everything between us started." Clara laughed, tears already forming in her eyes, and accepted not just the ring, but everything it represented. A life built not on rushed romance or frontier convenience, but on slow trust, shared work, and the mutual recognition of worth neither of them had received easily in their previous lives. The wedding took place in June 1882, at Round Hollow's small white church, in a simple ceremony that brought together practically the entire community that had grown up around Hollow Creek over the past 3 years. The cooperative families, Ruth Ashby and the school's students, Thomas Pruitt, Harlan Dunmore and his wife, and even Amos Fenwick, who traveled again from the neighboring county especially for the occasion. Mercy, now 7, insisted on carrying wildflowers she'd picked herself in the field behind the house, and cried with happiness so openly during the ceremony that it drew gentle laughter from the whole congregation. For the ceremony, Clara wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, her seamstress skill from Austin never fully abandoned, only transformed into something she now did by choice, not necessity. And, in the hidden pocket of her skirt, she carried the same worn leather notebook where she had recorded, 3 years earlier, her first failed attempts at curdling goat milk under the unforgiving Texas heat. The years that followed the wedding brought steady, almost quiet expansion of everything Clara and Nathaniel had started separately and now built together. The two properties, Hollow Creek and Reyes Ranch, remained formally distinct in the county records, a deliberate decision by Clara, who had insisted, even after the marriage, on keeping the title to her land in her own name, a condition Nathaniel had accepted without hesitation, understanding, more than most men of his time, the value of that independence to the woman he loved. In practice, though, the two pieces of land had functioned for years as a single integrated operation, with Nathaniel's cattle grazing freely across the fence that no longer separated anything but legal boundaries on paper, and Clara's cheese production expanding year after year with his steady support. In 1884, 2 years after the wedding, the couple's first child was born, a boy they named Ezra, in honor of the uncle Clara had never gotten to meet in person, but whose land and whose banking filing error had, ironically, become the foundation of everything she had built. 2 years later, in 1886, a girl was born, Louisa, a name chosen by Clara herself, without hesitation, in honor of Nathaniel's first wife, a gesture he never forgot, and that solidified, quietly but deeply, the respect he felt for a woman capable of honoring a past that wasn't hers without feeling threatened by it. The Hollow Creek Cooperative, which had begun with 5 families supplying goat milk in exchange for teaching and access to the aging cellar, grew throughout the 1880s to include 14 families from all across Blanco County, each contributing milk, labor, or both, and each receiving in return not just fair payment, but access to the knowledge Clara kept documenting year after year in the ever-growing pages of notebooks that replaced, one by one, the original worn leather notebook, which she now kept, carefully preserved, in a wooden box beside the bed, no longer a tool for daily work, but a keepsake of how it all began. The contract with Reginald Foster in San Antonio expanded steadily over the years, and by around 1888, the Whitfield cheese of Hollow Creek was recognized not just in the big city, but in fine grocery stores in Austin and even Houston, now shipped by railway instead of stagecoach, a logistical leap that cut delivery time in half and let the cheeses arrive even fresher at distant counters. A concrete symbol of how the small business, born from 37 sick goats, had become, nearly a decade later, a regional operation of real economic importance for all of Blanco County. The school Clara had funded in 1881 also grew beyond what she had originally imagined. In 1887, with the number of students surpassing 30, The community, not just Clara, but the cooperative families and other neighbors who had indirectly benefited from the prosperity she'd brought to the region, came together to build a second room, then a third, turning the small Clara's school into a formal, county-recognized community school, with 2 hired teachers and a curriculum that included, at Clara's insistence, not just reading and basic arithmetic, but also practical notions of agriculture, animal care, and household bookkeeping, knowledge she considered just as essential as any grammar lesson, especially for the girls of the region, who rarely received this kind of practical education anywhere else in the county. Ruth Ashby, the first hired teacher, stayed in Round Hollow for more than 15 years, eventually marrying one of the sons of one of the cooperative families and raising 3 children of her own who attended the very school where their mother taught. A cycle of continuity Clara watched with quiet satisfaction every time she walked to the building to check on how things were going, a habit she never gave up even after the school grew beyond her direct oversight. Mercy, the girl who had crossed the fence chasing a kitten one September afternoon in 1879, grew up under the combined care of Clara and Nathaniel, absorbing from early on both her father's practical patience and Clara's technical knowledge and tireless curiosity. At 14, she was already actively helping in the aging cellar, learning every stage of the cheese-making process with the same seriousness Clara had shown when learning from Baumgartner decades before. At 17, she insisted on traveling to San Antonio to personally follow the negotiations with Foster's chain of stores, determined to understand not just the production, but also the commercial side of the business that had shaped her entire childhood. "You've got your mother's head for numbers and your father's patience for animals," Clara remarked one day, watching Mercy negotiate a new supply contract with calm firmness with a skeptical merchant from Houston, never losing her composure or giving up more than she should. "It was Louisa who taught you that, you know, even without being here to see it." Mercy smiled, the same calm, observant smile that had become her trademark over the years. "It was you too, Clara. Both things can be true at once." The antagonists, who had each in their own way tried to diminish or destroy what Clara built, followed paths the Round Hollow community watched unfold over the years that followed, each receiving consequences proportional to the harm they had caused, with no need for any further intervention from Clara or Nathaniel beyond the simple act of continuing to build what they had already started. Elias Vance never returned to Texas after that October 1881 afternoon when he boarded the stagecoach without saying goodbye to anyone. Sparse news occasionally reached them through Thomas Pruitt's business acquaintances in Austin. Elias had reportedly gotten involved in at least 2 other questionable business schemes over the following decade, one of them resulting in a public legal dispute that permanently tarnished his reputation in Austin's business circles, forcing him to move, around 1890, to New Orleans, where he vanished from any news that reached Round Hollow. There was no reconciliation, no belated remorse communicated to Clara, just the gradual silence of a man whose greed never found the success he believed he deserved. Silas Corwin, on the other hand, followed a slower and more complex path. The shrinking of his bank, begun soon after the public exposure of his attempt to foreclose on Clara's forgotten debt, continued throughout the 1880s, until, in 1887, he was forced to sell controlling interest in the institution to the larger San Antonio Bank that had already been absorbing his operations for years. Unlike Elias, though, Corwin stayed in Round Hollow, now as a mere subordinate manager of the bank he had once owned, a daily humiliation he endured with a bitter resignation visible to anyone who observed him through the window of what had once been his own office. It was Nathaniel, surprisingly, who first extended something like reconciliation to Corwin, years later, when Corwin's youngest son, a 19-year-old named Peter, thin and tired-eyed, carrying the same quiet weight of shame that seemed to have marked the whole Corwin family since the bank's fall, showed up at Hollow Creek in 1889 looking for work, too ashamed to admit to his own father that he needed help, but desperate enough to seek it wherever it was offered. Nathaniel hired him without hesitation, and it was Clara who, months later, running into Corwin by chance on Round Hollow's main street, stopped to greet him with a calm cordiality he clearly didn't expect. "Your son is doing good work on the property," she said simply, no noticeable resentment in her voice. "Has a genuine talent for handling animals. A talent I imagine you never had the chance to see up close, given how much you worked at the bank." Corwin, caught off guard by the complete absence of bitterness in her voice, stammered an uncomfortable thank you, and something about that brief encounter, not full forgiveness, because the damage caused was never fully erased or forgotten, but a mutual recognition of humanity neither expected, marked the beginning of a distant but civil relationship between the two families, one that would continue, quietly, in the years that followed. Corwin never again held a position of financial power in Round Hollow, but he aged into a quieter man, more aware of his own past wrongdoing than he'd been in his arrogant younger years as a banker, and his relationship with his son, rebuilt in part thanks to the honest work Peter had found at Hollow Creek, became, according to those who knew them, the one genuine source of pride left to him in his final years. Opal Higgins, whose sharp tongue had caused so much discomfort in Clara's first months in Round Hollow, followed perhaps the simplest arc of all. Over the years, as she personally witnessed, year after year, the genuine prosperity Clara brought not just to herself, but to the whole surrounding community. Her initial distrust transformed, first into cautious respect, then into something close to declared admiration, though she never directly admitted how wrong she'd been in her early suspicions. She became, in time, one of the most enthusiastic voices defending Clara's reputation whenever any outsider questioned the legitimacy of the success of that woman who arrived alone with a trunk and a handful of sick goats, retelling the story, year after year, with an almost possessive pride, as if she herself had witnessed every step of its building with approval from day one. A small irony Clara noticed, but chose to let pass without comment, understanding that people changed, and that acknowledging that was worth more than holding on to old grudges over old rumors. Harlan Dunmore, the store owner who had originally offered 20 cents a cheese on consignment with obvious reluctance, became over the years one of the region's biggest commercial champions of Clara's, openly proud of having been the first to sell Whitfield cheese, a claim that conveniently left out how much he doubted the product at the start. His store, boosted by the commercial traffic Hollow Creek's prosperity brought to the whole town, expanded considerably over the decade, and Harlan, despite his original stinginess, never once stopped buying the cooperative's surplus production at increasingly fair prices, in a tacit acknowledgement, never stated aloud, of how much he owed to the success he had initially underestimated. The turn of the century arrived at Hollow Creek almost quietly, marked not by grand celebrations, but by the contented stillness of a life that had settled over 20 years of steady work. In 1900, Clara was 44, her hair already gray at the temples, her hands still calloused from the daily work she had never fully set aside, even after the cheese operation, now largely run by Mercy, who at 25 had taken over most of the commercial negotiations with a competence that made Clara smile with quiet pride every time she watched her work, had grown beyond anything she had imagined possible on that hot afternoon in 1879 when she'd paid $2 for a herd no one else wanted. Ezra, the couple's eldest son, had followed a different path than Clara might have expected, passionate about veterinary medicine since childhood, having watched closely the meticulous care his mother gave every sick animal that arrived at the property. He traveled to St. Louis, Missouri, the same state where Clara had learned from Baumgartner decades before, a coincidence, she noted with a mix of nostalgia and pride, to study at one of the first formal veterinary medicine schools in the United States, returning in 1906 to establish, in Round Hollow itself, the first formal veterinary practice in all of Blanco County, treating not just the family's animals, but those of the whole region, which had previously relied entirely on folk knowledge, often inaccurate, to treat illnesses in cattle and goats. Louisa, the youngest daughter, grew up with a different passion, but one just as rooted in her mother's lessons. She became interested, early on, in the educational side of Clara's work, spending more and more time at the community school helping Ruth Ashby, until, at 21, in 1907, she formally took over as head of the institution her mother had helped found 26 years before, now a real school. With 6 rooms, 4 hired teachers, and more than 80 students coming from across the whole region, including, for the first time in the county's history, a small night program for adults who'd never had the chance to learn to read as children, a project Louisa herself had conceived after repeatedly hearing stories of older farmers who signed important contracts with nothing but an X, never fully understanding what they were signing. Nathaniel, already 52 in 1900, gradually handed over the day-to-day running of the ranch to Ezra and a growing group of hired hands, devoting himself more and more to what he'd always done best: walking the land, watching the cattle, settling disputes between neighbors with the same practical calm that had defined all his decisions throughout his life. He aged alongside Clara with the same quiet partnership that had bound them from the start, the two of them often found sitting on the same porch where he'd proposed to her with a wrapped cheese and a hidden ring, watching the sunset over land that, decades before, had barely produced enough hay to feed a small herd, and that now stretched, between the two properties joined in practice if not formally, across more than 400 acres of productive land. It was on one of those afternoons, in 1912, with Clara already 56 and her hair fully gray, that she received an unexpected letter, not from an old antagonist, nor about business, but from an unknown young woman in Missouri, a granddaughter of Herr Baumgartner, who, going through the belongings of the grandfather who had died years earlier, had found an old letter Clara had written him in 1883, thanking him for everything she'd learned and telling him, with proud detail, about the cooperative she had founded in his honor. The granddaughter, now herself interested in learning the family trade, asked whether she might visit Hollow Creek to learn directly from the woman her grandfather, according to his own letters preserved over the years, had always considered his best student. Clara cried, reading that letter, sitting on the same porch where so many important decisions of her life had been made, feeling the full weight of the circle closing, the knowledge an old Swiss immigrant had given her, asking nothing in return but a willing student, now returning, decades later, through a granddaughter seeking the very same thing Clara had sought when she'd arrived in Missouri, orphaned and without means, decades before. The young woman, named Greta Baumgartner, arrived at Hollow Creek in the spring of 1913, bringing with her a letter of introduction written by her own mother and a small notebook of her grandfather's, whose pages, worn by time and travel, held recipes written in German that Clara recognized instantly, even without fully mastering the language, from the familiar structure of every step, the same method, almost word for word, that Herr Baumgartner had taught her personally decades before, now returning to her through the careful handwriting of the granddaughter he'd left behind. Greta spent 2 full years learning from Clara, not just the cheese-making techniques, now refined over more than 3 decades of constant practice, but also the broader philosophy Clara had developed throughout her life. That true knowledge only had complete value when shared. That competence, hidden out of fear of judgment, was wasted competence. And that the true measure of success lay not in what one accumulated for oneself, but in what one left behind, able to keep growing even after the hand that had planted it was no longer there to tend it directly. Greta Baumgartner wasn't the only one to arrive seeking the knowledge Clara had accumulated over more than 3 decades. As the reputation of Whitfield cheese spread, now recognized not just in San Antonio, Austin, and Houston, but occasionally mentioned in regional agricultural publications, documenting the successful methods of small producers across Texas, young farm women and farmers from neighboring communities, and even from distant states like Missouri and New Mexico, began writing letters asking for advice, some traveling in person to Hollow Creek to learn directly from the woman who, decades before, had bought 37 sick goats for $2 when no one else wanted them. Clara, already in her 60s around 1916, formalized for the first time what she had done informally for decades. She turned part of Ezra's original property into a small summer agricultural school, offering during June and July intensive courses in cheesemaking, goat care, and basic principles of rural cooperativism to anyone willing to learn, charging only enough to cover the cost of materials, never seeking personal profit from that specific project, which she always considered a debt being repaid, not to Corwin, not to any bank, but to Herr Baumgartner, and by extension, to everyone who had ever offered knowledge without demanding anything but a willing student. It was during one of these summer classes, in 1918, that Clara, already 62, told out loud for the first time, in front of a group of 18 students gathered in the aging cellar, the same cellar Ezra Whitfield had dug decades before, now expanded 3 times beyond its original size, the full story of the 37 sick goats, of the auctioneer who had laughed, of the farmers who had shaken their heads in disbelief, and of the simple but determined decision of a 23-year-old woman who had nothing but hidden knowledge and a will to work. People will always judge the worth of something by its most obvious appearance, she told the assembled students, her voice still firm despite her age, the same calm, practical tone that had defined every important decision of her life. An auctioneer sees a sick goat and sees a loss. A banker sees a woman alone and sees weakness. A rejected suitor sees independence and sees a challenge to be conquered. But the real value of anything, animal, land, person, is never in the first impression others form. It's in what you're willing to build, with patience, when no one else is paying attention. One of the students, a young man from a poor family in the neighboring county, raised his hand and asked whether she had ever been afraid of failing completely, of losing everything she'd built in the face of so many threats over the years. The forgotten debt, the contest of the will, the rumors spread through town. Clara thought for a moment before answering, looking through the open cellar door at the field stretching beyond, green and productive in a way Ezra's original rocky land had never been. "I was afraid the whole time," she answered, with an honesty that surprised some of the younger students, used to imagining success as the complete absence of doubt. "But I learned, early, that fear and action aren't opposites. You can be afraid and keep working anyway. What matters isn't never feeling fear. It's never letting fear decide your worth for you." The year 1920 brought the death of Thomas Pruitt, the lawyer who had first located Clara in Austin decades before and who had remained, throughout her whole life at Hollow Creek, one of the steadiest and most discreet allies of her journey. Clara and Nathaniel, now 64 and 58 respectively, attended the funeral with the same quiet respect that had defined their entire professional and personal relationship with the man who, without fanfare, had made sure Ezra Whitfield's will was protected when it mattered most. It was also around this time that Clara, going back through the old leather notebooks that documented every stage of her journey, now carefully kept in a glass case in the main room of the house, alongside family photographs gathered over decades, found, among the yellowed pages of the first notebook, the exact entry for the day she'd bought the 37 goats, July 2nd, 1879. 37 head, $2. No one else wanted them. I'll prove them wrong. The line, written in the still uncertain handwriting of a 23-year-old woman newly arrived in unfamiliar land, made Clara smile, decades later, with a satisfaction that needed no witness but herself to be complete. The 1920s brought Clara and Nathaniel's first grandchildren, Mercy's children. She had married in 1908 a young veterinarian named Daniel Hobbs, one of Ezra's fellow students during his years in Missouri, who had moved to Round Hollow after falling in love not just with Mercy, but with the prosperous, connected life she represented. The first grandchild, named Ezra, in honor of both the original great-uncle and Ezra Whitfield Reyes himself, was born in 1910, followed by two sisters over the following decade, each growing up on the same property where their grandmother, decades before, had arrived alone and unknown, carrying a cracked trunk and a guarded secret about cheese and goats. Clara, now a grandmother, developed with the grandchildren the same patient habit that had defined her relationship with Mercy decades before, leading them by the hand into the aging cellar, teaching them, little by little, to recognize the right smell of a well-cured cheese, the exact touch that signaled full maturity, the small weather variations that still, even after 40 years of practice, demanded constant adjustment and careful attention. She told them over and over, always with small variations but never losing its essence, the story of the 37 goats, a story that had become, over the years, almost a family legend, retold at Sunday dinners, shared with curious visitors, and eventually written down by Louisa, who, in her role as head of the community school, decided to include the story as an informal part of the local curriculum. A practical example of perseverance she considered more valuable to the region's children than any abstract lesson from a textbook brought in from elsewhere. Nathaniel died in 1928, at 81, of natural causes, surrounded by the whole family in the same house where he'd lived most of his adult life. His death, though expected, given his advanced age, hit Clara with a weight she never imagined feeling so intensely, even after decades of solid, predictable partnership. He was buried in the small church cemetery at Round Hollow, beside Louisa, his first wife, a decision he himself had made clear in life, and that Clara, far from feeling jealousy or resentment, supported with the same generous understanding she had always shown toward his past, understanding, as she always had, that genuine love didn't need to erase what came before it in order to be real. He taught me that trust is built slowly, through small, repeated actions, not big promises, Clara said, at the funeral, before a crowd that included practically the entire adult population of Round Hollow and the surrounding area, many of them children and grandchildren of the original cooperative families she and Nathaniel had helped build decades before. That's how he treated me from the very first day. When he offered me lumber no one else was using to fix a fence no one else thought was worth fixing. I spent almost 50 years by his side, and every day carried a little of that same practical, quiet kindness which never needed big words to be felt deeply. Clara lived 14 more years after Nathaniel's death, continuing to oversee, with ever less physical strength but the same clarity of mind as always, the operation that had grown, over more than 60 years, into something far larger than anything she could have imagined on that hot July afternoon in 1879. The Hollow Creek Cooperative, formally established in 1925 as a registered agricultural association, the first of its kind in all of Blanco County, had been operating for more than 4 decades, now under the joint management of Mercy, Ezra, and a new generation of regional farmers who had grown up hearing Clara's story as a natural part of the community's own identity. In the final years of her life, already in her 80s, Clara came to spend more and more time simply watching, sitting on the same porch where, decades earlier, she'd shared her first cup of coffee with Nathaniel, where he'd proposed to her with a piece of cheese hiding a ring, where so many important decisions of her life had been made with deliberate calm rather than impulsive haste. She watched her grandchildren grow up, watched great-grandchildren be born, the first of them a girl named Clara Louisa Hobbs, born in 1935, daughter of the eldest grandson, named in honor of both her great-grandmother and the woman whose name Clara had always insisted on honoring, even decades after knowing her only through Nathaniel's memories. It was on an autumn afternoon in 1938, with Clara already 82, that the moment happened the family would later recall as the most symbolic of her final years. Her great-granddaughter Clara Louisa, then only 3, had slipped away from her mother's watch during a Sunday family gathering and was found, hours later, sitting in the pen where the goat herd, a direct descendant, through successive generations of careful breeding, of the 37 sick goats bought in 1879, grazed peacefully under the afternoon sun. The girl wasn't scared or crying, she was simply sitting in the dirt, watching the animals with the same quiet, curious attention that had defined Clara at 23 decades before. "She's got the same way about her that you had," Mercy remarked, now 63 herself, helping her grandmother up from the porch chair to go check on the great-granddaughter. "That way of watching everything before deciding what to do." Clara walked slowly to the pen, leaning on Mercy's arm, and watched her great-granddaughter for a long moment before approaching, crouching down with difficulty beside the girl, the two of them watching together the same animals that, decades before, almost no one in Round Hollow believed were worth the money paid for them. "Do you know what these goats mean, little one?" Clara asked, her voice weaker than before, but still carrying the same calm, practical tone as always. The girl shook her head, her big eyes fixed on the animals. "They mean that no one, not even you sometimes, really knows what something is worth just by looking at it from a distance. You have to get close, take care of it, be patient. That's how your great-great-grandmother, how I myself, learned everything I know, and that's how this whole piece of land, this school, this whole cooperative got started, with 37 goats no one else wanted, and a woman willing to prove they were worth it." It was the last significant moment the family recorded in writing before Clara's death, which came the following spring, in April 1939, at 83, in the same bed where she had slept most of her adult life at Hollow Creek, surrounded by Mercy, Ezra, Louisa, their spouses, and most of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, on a quiet morning when, according to Mercy's later account, she simply closed her eyes after asking for the bedroom window to be opened so she could smell the earth wet from a light rain that had fallen during the night. Clara Whitfield Reyes's funeral drew, according to the regional newspapers of the time, more than 300 people, the largest funeral service Round Hollow had ever witnessed, with families coming not just from Blanco County, but from neighboring communities across central Texas, many of them direct or indirect descendants of the original cooperative families she had founded almost 60 years before. She was buried beside Nathaniel, in the same small church cemetery where the two had married decades before, her simple headstone, by explicit instruction left in her will, engraved only with her name, her birth and death dates, and a single line she had chosen herself years before, when she'd begun formally putting her final affairs in order. She built with what no one else wanted. In the years following Clara's death, the operation she'd founded kept growing under the management of her children and grandchildren, but what stood out most, according to historical records later preserved by the Blanco County Historical Society, was the way her story, not just the commercial facts of her rise, but the specific method she'd developed for building prosperity through calculated generosity and shared teaching, became, over the following decades, a model studied and replicated in other rural communities across central Texas. In 1952, more than a decade after her death, the Agricultural University of Texas published a small case study on the Hollow Creek Cooperative, documenting how a simple model of sharing knowledge and resources among small rural producers could transform, across generations, the entire economy of a historically poor region. Ezra Whitfield Reyes, the veterinarian's son, kept practicing in Round Hollow until his own retirement in 1958, having trained, over the decades, 4 other younger veterinarians he himself had mentored informally, expanding the reach of professional animal care far beyond the original boundaries of Blanco County. He died in 1965, at 81, the same age his father had died decades before, leaving behind not just an established veterinary practice, but a tradition of practical teaching that directly echoed the philosophy his mother had developed decades earlier in the cheese aging cellar. Louisa Reyes, the educator daughter, expanded Hollow Creek's community school over the decades until, in 1960, it officially became part of the county's public education system. One of the first rural schools in Central Texas to formally integrate adult education programs as a permanent part of its curriculum, a direct legacy of the small night program she herself had started in 1907, decades before, moved by the simple observation of farmers signing important contracts with nothing but an X. Louisa died in 1971, at 85, having lived long enough to see her own granddaughter graduate as one of the first women in the county to complete formal university education, a milestone she always credited. In interviews given to local papers throughout her life, directly to her mother's original vision of the practical, transformative value of education for the region's girls and women. Mercy Reyes Hobbs, the girl who had crossed the fence chasing a kitten one September afternoon in 1879, a date the family itself came to informally celebrate, year after year, as Cat Day, a small family tradition that persisted for generations, ran the cooperative's commercial operations for more than 4 decades after Clara's death, expanding the commercial reach of Whitfield cheese beyond the borders of Texas, establishing, in the 1950s, the first distribution contracts outside the state, reaching specialty markets in New Orleans and, eventually, Chicago. She died in 1974 at 99, having lived through nearly an entire century of history, personally witnessing every transformation that had taken place at Hollow Creek since that distant afternoon when she'd been found, a child dirty with earth, laughing at a cat fleeing from her on the neighboring property. The cooperative itself, legally formalized in 1925, continued operating without interruption throughout the entire 20th century, surviving the Great Depression precisely thanks to the model of mutual solidarity Clara had conceived decades before, when other small producers in the region failed on their own, unable to withstand the sharp drop in agricultural prices in the early 1930s. The families of Hollow Creek, bound together by decades of shared resources and knowledge, managed to get through the hardest years by combining production, spreading risk, and drawing on the communal reserve fund Clara herself had insisted on establishing back in the cooperative's earliest years, a decision many had considered excessively cautious at the time, but that proved essential to collective survival decades later. In 1979, exactly 100 years after the original purchase of the 37 sick goats, the Round Hollow community, now a town of nearly 3,000 people, transformed over a century of gradual but steady growth, driven in large part by the prosperity Hollow Creek had brought to the region, organized a formal centennial celebration of the cooperative, with descendants of practically every original family gathered on the very property where it had all begun. A bronze plaque, commissioned by the County Historical Society, was installed at the entrance of the property, near the original dividing fence between Hollow Creek and Reyes Ranch, the same fence where a goat named Dinah had escaped in 1879, and where, decades later, a man named Nathaniel Reyes had proposed marriage to a woman with a cheese hiding a ring. The plaque bore a simple inscription, drafted by a great-grandson of Clara's who had become a local historian, after months of going through old letters, cooperative meeting minutes, and his great-grandmother's own preserved notebooks, trying to find the words that best summed up nearly a century of history without turning it into the kind of sentimental exaggeration she herself, even in life, had always avoided. Here, in 1879, Clara Whitfield arrived alone, with little more than hidden knowledge and quiet determination. What she built was not just a prosperous property, but a model of generosity that proved, generation after generation, that true worth is never in a thing's first appearance, but in the patience of one willing to tend it until it reveals what it's really worth. The goat herd, direct descendants of the original 37 bought for $2 that distant summer of 1879, continued to exist at Hollow Creek throughout the entire following century, carefully maintained through successive generations of selective breeding that preserved the same qualities Clara had originally identified in those sick, underestimated animals: resilience, adaptability, and a remarkable ability to produce, even under adverse conditions, exceptionally high-quality milk. The property's successive administrators, first Mercy, then her own children, and eventually a fifth generation of Clara's descendants who took over the operation around the turn of the 21st century, kept that specific bloodline alive not just for commercial value, but out of historical reverence, a living, continuing symbol of the original decision that had started everything. At some point in the 1990s, a journalist from a small regional newspaper in central Texas, researching stories of pioneering women in the state's agriculture, visited Hollow Creek and interviewed Clara's great-granddaughter who then ran the property, a woman named Eleanor Reyes Kaminsky, who showed the journalist the original worn leather notebooks, preserved for more than a century, now kept under glass in a small room turned into an informal memorial inside the original house, alongside black and white photographs of young Clara, of Nathaniel, of Mercy as a child running after a cat whose name no one ever knew. "People always ask what her secret was," Eleanor told the journalist, according to the article published weeks later, running her finger carefully over the cracked leather cover of the oldest notebook, preserved for more than a century under the glass of the small memorial. And the answer, honestly, was never any special secret. It was patience. It was refusing to believe that the worth of something, animal, land, person, could be determined just by the first impression others formed. She saw potential where no one else did, and then did the slow, entirely unglamorous work of cultivating that potential until it became undeniable. That's not a secret. That's just work, repeated every single day, for years, without giving up. The article, originally published in a small regional paper, ended up being reprinted, in the years that followed, in larger publications interested in stories of rural resilience and female entrepreneurship in historical contexts, and the story of Clara Whitfield, almost without the family itself fully realizing the scale it was taking on, became, decades after her death, a small but persistent example cited in studies on agricultural cooperativism and on the historic, often forgotten role of women in building 19th-century American rural communities' economies. The dividing fence between Hollow Creek and Reyes Ranch, rebuilt and reinforced multiple times over more than a century, remained, even after the two properties were formally unified under a single-family management in the 1960s, as a physical landmark deliberately preserved by the family, not removed, even once it had stopped serving any real practical function, because it carried a symbolic weight no descendant ever wanted to erase. It was there, at that exact point on the property, that a goat named Dinah had escaped one July afternoon in 1879, sparking the first real encounter between Clara Whitfield and Nathaniel Reyes. It was there that, decades later, he had proposed marriage to her. And it was there that, year after year, generation after generation, the family gathered informally on special occasions, retelling the same story that had begun with an escaped goat and a forgotten pile of lumber near a creek. In the room turned into a memorial inside the original Hollow Creek house, there was an object Eleanor Reyes Kaminsky always pointed out to any curious visitor who asked about the family's history: a small piece of cotton cloth, faded and fragile with age, preserved inside a glass case beside the leather notebooks. It was the same kind of cloth Clara had used over decades to wrap every disc of cheese she produced. The same kind of cloth Nathaniel had used to wrap the engagement ring that April afternoon in 1882, hidden inside a piece of aged cheese delivered at the dividing fence where it had all begun. She kept that particular piece until the end of her life, Eleanor would explain to visitors, retelling a story she'd heard, as a child, directly from her own grandmother Mercy, who in turn had heard it from Clara. She used to say it was a reminder that the most important things in life sometimes arrive wrapped in a way too simple to catch your attention right away. that you had to unwrap it carefully, with patience, to find out what was really inside. The line, repeated through successive generations of the family, became a kind of informal motto passed down to each new generation of Clara and Nathaniel's descendants. A constant reminder that genuine worth rarely announced itself loudly, that it almost always demanded the kind of patient attention willing to look past first impressions that Clara had shown for the first time publicly on that distant morning in 1879 when she'd raised her hand in front of a laughing auctioneer and bought 37 goats no one else wanted. The Hollow Creek property, across more than a century of continuous history, never once stopped producing cheese the same handcrafted way Clara had originally perfected, even after modern industrial dairy techniques became available and, in many cases, more profitable for smaller-scale operations like the family's. The decision to keep the traditional methods, repeated by each successive generation of managers, was never purely sentimental. Whitfield cheese, made exactly as Clara had taught, continued, more than a century later, to be recognized for its exceptional quality, now sold not just in regional grocery stores, but, through modern specialty distribution channels, to fine restaurants across Texas and occasionally even other states, a tangible testament that the slow, patient method Clara had developed in her first failed attempts at curdling milk under the merciless August heat of 1879 remained, more than a century later, superior to any industrial shortcut modernity had to offer. The community school, folded into the public system since 1960, had been operating for more than a century since its original founding in 1881, having trained, across generations, thousands of students from the region, many of them direct descendants of the original cooperative families, others simply residents of a community that had grown, prospered, and transformed around an institution that a young, almost accidental widow, at 25, had decided to build not because she needed to, but because she believed, with the same calm conviction that defined her whole life, that shared knowledge was worth more than any profit kept only for herself. Anyone visiting Hollow Creek today, more than 140 years after that hot July afternoon in 1879, would find a property that had grown far beyond the 120 rocky acres originally left by Ezra Whitfield, but would also find, if they paid close enough attention, the same essential elements Clara had established from the start. The stone cellar, expanded generation after generation, but still built on the original structure Ezra had dug decades before Clara was even born. The pen where the goat herd, direct descendants of that group of 37 sick animals, still grazed under the same unforgiving central Texas sun. And the dividing fence, rebuilt countless times over more than a century, but deliberately kept in the exact same spot where a goat named Dinah had escaped and changed, without anyone able to predict it at the time, the course of so many lives. The story of Clara Whitfield, told and retold across generations, first as the living memory of those who had known her personally, then as family legend passed down by Mercy and her descendants, and eventually as a case study cited in academic publications on rural cooperativism and on the forgotten role of women in building 19th-century American agricultural economy, remained fundamentally the same at its core, despite all the layers of time and retelling that gathered around it. The story of a woman who had arrived alone, underestimated by nearly everyone around her, and who chose, again and again, over decades, to build value where no one else saw potential, not through strokes of luck or dramatic interventions, but through the slow, steady patience of someone who understood that the most lasting things in life are rarely built fast. At the end of each afternoon, when the Texas sun began to sink over the fields of Hollow Creek exactly as it had sunk that first distant afternoon, Clara arrived leading 37 goats on foot down the dirt road. The golden light still covered the same landscape she had seen for the first time at 23. The creek that filled in spring and dried in summer, the stone cellar cool even on the hottest days, the fields she had transformed, with her own hands and decades of patient work, from nearly useless rocky land into something thriving and alive. And it was exactly there, in that golden late afternoon light over the land, a determined young woman had refused to let anyone else's first impression define. That the true measure of everything Clara Whitfield built remained visible, needing no bronze plaque or newspaper article to prove its worth. In the smell of dry hay mixed with the wet earth near the creek, in the distant steady sound of the bells tied around the necks of goats grazing slowly among the stones, in the long shadow the old stone cellar cast over the field every afternoon, at the exact same hour, since before anyone still living there could remember it any other way. In the land itself, alive, productive, and continuing, generation after generation to grow, exactly as she had always known, from the very first day, that it would, if only someone had the patience to take proper care of it.